Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we plunge into the heart of complex topics, bringing you the most important insights, surprising facts, and perhaps a few moments where everything you thought you knew gets delightfully upended. Today, we're dissecting a phrase that has immense weight in modern discussions, particularly around reproductive rights, the culture of life. On its face, it sounds so clear, so morally unimpeachable, often even imbued with a sense of divine authority and, timeless truth. But the question that sparked this entire deep dive for us was, has this clarity, this seemingly eternal and universal truth, always been the historical norm? Or is there a more nuanced, perhaps even startling story waiting beneath the surface?
That's precisely the mission for our deep dive today. We're going to embark on an intellectual excavation, if you will, to unpack the complex and often contradictory history of views on abortion. Our goal is to extract key insights, to challenge some deeply ingrained assumptions that many of us hold about the origins and consistency of these beliefs. We'll be sharply contrasting contemporary Catholic doctrine with some truly unexpected historical nuances found in medieval Christian and Islamic traditions, and then bringing it forward to explore the powerful counter-narratives that emerged from modern feminist movements. Think of it as your expedited pathway to being genuinely well-informed on a topic that is far too often reduced to simplistic binaries. We're here to reveal a historical landscape far more intricate than commonly presented.
And for this particular journey into the past, our insights come primarily from a rigorous analysis, drawing heavily from an excellent academic piece titled Quickening to Conception, the Historical Collapse of Nuance in Catholic Abortion Doctrine. It's a study that truly peels back the layers of centuries of thought. So the core question we're grappling with throughout this deep dive is fundamental. How do we reconcile the current, often absolutist position on abortion, which many perceive as ancient and unchanging, with historical views that were, frankly, far more conditional and varied?
It's more than a question. It's a foundational challenge to a prevailing narrative. The historical record, when examined closely, doesn't point to a smooth, unbroken consistency. Instead, it reveals a profound shift. We'll be delving into concepts like quickening and ensoulment. These were not mere theological footnotes. For centuries, they served as critical developmental thresholds that profoundly influenced the moral and legal status of a fetus. What we're going to uncover isn't an unbroken tradition passed down through millennia, but rather what many scholars now identify as a significant theological rupture, a redefinition of life itself that transformed how society, particularly Western society, understood the very beginning of human personhood. Prepare to have some assumptions about historical continuity genuinely tested.
Let's begin our exploration there then, unpacking the culture of life, a modern invention. So let's anchor ourselves in the present. When we encounter the phrase the culture of life in contemporary discourse, particularly within Catholic circles, it's not just a slogan, is it? It carries immense moral weight. It instantly evokes this powerful sense of moral clarity, a perceived divine authority, almost an eternal truth that feels as if it has always been present, always meant the same thing since time immemorial.
It absolutely does. This modern absolutist position, as it's predominantly understood and articulated today, found its most forceful and comprehensive expression in Pope John Paul II's seminal 1995 encyclical Evangelium Vitae, which translates as the Gospel of Life. This isn't just a simple statement. It's a sprawling, deeply theological document that unequivocally frames human life as beginning at conception. Consequently, any intentional termination of that life from that very first moment is presented as equivalent to murder. It's a very strong, deeply rooted theological and moral pronouncement, crafted to leave no room for ambiguity or equivocation. It aims to establish a universal and unyielding principle.
Okay, let's unpack this. Does this absolutist position stand in contrast to earlier views? You're suggesting that this absolutist position stands in stark contrast to earlier views, not just in other traditions, but within Christianity itself. What does the historical record reveal about how this divergence occurred?
That's the critical pivot point of our discussion. The historical evidence is indeed quite compelling and, for many, quite surprising. When we delve into the rich intellectual tapestries of medieval Christian traditions, and even more broadly into the sophisticated legal and medical frameworks of Islamic traditions, we consistently find views on abortion that were far more nuanced, more conditional, and less uniformly condemnatory than the modern stance. They simply were not operating with the same level of absolute prescription from conception that we see articulated today. The idea of a universal condemnation from the moment of fertilization is remarkably absent from much of pre-modern history.
Can you offer some specific, concrete examples of that historical nuance? What were these earlier traditions actually saying, and how did they interpret the stages of human development in relation to moral status?
Certainly. Let's look at 13th century England, a period of significant legal and intellectual development. Highly influential legal scholars of the time, such as those responsible for compiling the authoritative legal treatise known as Doctrine, or On the Laws and Customs of England, made very precise distinctions. They differentiated meticulously between what they termed formed and unformed fetuses. Crucially, they considered abortion a crime, specifically a form of homicide, only after the fetus had quickened. This was a pivotal legal and moral distinction, directly influencing how such cases were prosecuted and punished. Before quickening, while perhaps seen as a sin, it was not classified as murder in the eyes of the law.
And this concept of a developmental threshold wasn't exclusively a Christian one, was it? You mentioned that medieval Islamic physicians had a similarly non-absolutist approach, often described as more empirically grounded. How do their views align or diverge?
That's absolutely correct, and it highlights a fascinating cross-cultural parallel. In medieval Islamic medicine, as extensively documented in widely circulated texts like Ibn al-Jazar's Zad al-Musafir, Provisions for the Traveler, abortion was frequently tolerated up to the point of ensoulment. While there were scholarly debates among Islamic jurists and theologians about the precise timing, ensoulment was most commonly defined as occurring around 120 days after conception, roughly 4 months into pregnancy. This acceptance of abortion prior to this ensoulment point highlights a fundamentally different approach to fetal status and the moral permissibility of terminating a pregnancy, an approach rooted in observed physiological development rather than a strict theological stance from conception.
So what we're seeing,
Yeah.
it's this deep moral and medical complexity, really. The initial aha moment for the listener might just be this. These historical traditions, they show something very different from the modern culture of life narrative. It implies this theological rupture you mentioned, right, away from its own history.
Precisely. It suggests the modern narrative erases a lot of its own past complexity. 2. Medieval and Islamic nuance. A different understanding of life and personhood. It is indeed a powerful revelation, and understanding this historical complexity is absolutely crucial to grasping the full picture. Contrary to the common, often polemical rhetoric found in much of modern pro-life advocacy, medieval Christian and Islamic approaches fundamentally did not treat all fetal life as equivalent from the moment of conception. This is a profound and foundational divergence from the contemporary Catholic stance, which posits full human personhood from the instant of fertilization. Their frameworks were, by modern standards, remarkably flexible and developmental.
What's fascinating here is how both of these rich traditions, despite their distinct theological and legal systems, incorporated these crucial developmental thresholds to determine moral and legal status. It wasn't a static single point of origin, but a recognition of stages.
Precisely. These distinctions weren't arbitrary or based on fleeting cultural whims. They were deeply integrated into sophisticated philosophical, theological, and even proto-scientific understandings of embryology and personhood prevalent at the time. This perspective recognized a gradual process of human development where the moral and legal status of the fetus accrued over time. It's a framework that is, as you said, far removed from the instantaneous absolutist view that dominates modern Catholicism, which typically posits full personhood and moral status from the very first moments of a zygote's existence. For medieval thinkers, life was a process, not an immediate state from conception.
Let's dive into the specifics of Doctrine, this 13th century English legal treatise. It seems to be a cornerstone document for understanding medieval Christian legal thought on this matter. What exactly did it stipulate regarding abortion?
Doctrine, often considered the most authoritative and systematic treatise on English common law in the Middle Ages, was quite explicit. It classified abortion as a form of homicide only when the fetus was formed or quickened, with particular emphasis on the quickened stage. This meant that prior to quickening, the act of terminating a pregnancy was not considered the killing of a human being in the same legal sense as, say, killing an adult. This wasn't merely a legal loophole, it reflected a genuine and widespread theological and philosophical understanding of fetal development. The legal system was directly informed by the prevailing scientific and spiritual understanding of when a distinct human life, with a soul, truly began.
So what does quickened actually mean in this context? Because that term isn't used in this way in common parlance today, and its meaning is crucial for understanding the historical difference.
Yeah. Quickening referred to the deeply significant point when the pregnant person could first physically feel fetal movement. This palpable sensation wasn't just a biological milestone, it was imbued with profound spiritual and legal meaning. It was widely understood as the moment when the fetus truly came to life, when it received a soul, thus becoming animated and distinguishable from mere potential. This concept was deeply rooted in the intellectual giants of the age. It drew heavily on Augustine's theology, which posited a gradual animation of the fetus, and even more significantly, on Aristotle's widely accepted embryology, which provided the scientific framework for understanding development. Aristotle, whose works were central to medieval scholasticism, described a process where the embryo progressively acquired different types of souls, first vegetative, then animal, and finally a rational human soul, each corresponding to observed stages of development. The crucial point here is that for centuries, under this Augustinian and Aristotelian intellectual lineage, the soul was not believed to be infused at conception. Instead, it was thought to occur at a later observable stage, typically once the fetus had taken on a recognizably human form and begun to move, usually between the 18th and 20th week of gestation. This gradualist view permeated legal, medical, and theological thought.
And this is where the nuance really comes into sharp focus, because what were the legal and moral consequences if the fetus hadn't yet quickened? What was the attitude toward abortion before this point?
Before quickening, abortion was not classified as murder. The legal frameworks, while acknowledging it as a serious moral issue, did not assign it the same legal gravity as ending a quickened life. Instead, it was considered more akin to contraception or perhaps a moral transgression, but one that was generally deemed unworthy of legal prosecution as homicide. This detail is incredibly important for you, the listener, to grasp because it starkly differentiates historical, legal, and moral frameworks from the modern absolutist one. The legal system simply did not treat all fetal life as fully equivalent from conception, demonstrating a recognition of developmental stages that is absent from current doctrine. It was not a capital crime, unlike what would become the norm much later.
That's a pretty significant distinction, highlighting a very different understanding of personhood. Now let's transition to Islamic medical texts, because you noted their similarly non-absolutist approach, often described as more empirically grounded. How do their views align or diverge from the Christian context, and what does this reveal about their medical practices?
Islamic medical texts, building on a robust tradition of scientific inquiry that often surpassed contemporary European knowledge, adopted a remarkably pragmatic and often detailed perspective on reproductive matters. Consider Ibn al-Jazar's widely used Arabic medical compendium, Zad al-Musafir, Provisions for the Traveler, which was a foundational text for physicians across the Islamic world. This text was highly influential, and notably, it included an entire chapter that meticulously detailed various abortifacient substances and described methods and compounds used to induce abortion. This wasn't an obscure or condemned section, it was presented as part of a physician's practical knowledge base.
But there's a fascinating historical event tied to that specific text, isn't there? Didn't something happen when it was translated into Latin for European audiences?
Yes, it's a crucial detail that underscores the cultural divergence we're discussing. When Constantinus Africanus, a pivotal figure in the transmission of Arabic medical knowledge to the Latin West, translated Zad al-Musafir into Latin in the 11th century, he deliberately censored that entire chapter on abortion. He simply omitted it from the Latin translation, which then became one of the most foundational and widely studied medical texts in European universities for centuries. This act of omission profoundly shaped the knowledge available to Western physicians and scholars.
What's the implication of this omission? Because for a modern reader, it could easily be misunderstood as reflecting Islamic condemnation, when in fact it seems to suggest the opposite.
That's exactly the point to clarify for our listeners. The omission by Constantinus Africanus actually reflects Christian discomfort and burgeoning condemnation with the topic rather than an Islamic one. In the original Arabic text, Ibn al-Jazar justified including these abortive remedies by explaining their dual utility. They could be used not only to terminate pregnancies, but also to evacuate dead fetuses, a necessary medical intervention for the woman's health. He even offered a pious disclaimer within the original text, acknowledging the gravity of such matters and emphasizing the importance of a physician's moral discernment, but the practical medical knowledge was still openly presented. More broadly, across Islamic scholarship, abortion was widely accepted up until ensoulment. A moment, as I mentioned, that many prominent Islamic scholars, drawing from the Quran and Hadith, specifically defined as occurring at 120 days post-conception, or roughly 4 months into gestation. This historical practice demonstrates a medical and ethical framework that was quite distinct from later Christian developments and reveals a pragmatism in Islamic law that prioritized the woman's life and health in certain circumstances.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, what does this shared logic between medieval Christian and Islamic traditions tell us? If we connect all these threads together, the medieval Christian legal distinctions, the nuanced understanding of quickening and ensoulment, and the pragmatic approach in Islamic medical traditions, what does this shared logic tell us about how societies viewed life and reproduction back then, especially compared to the prevailing views today?
It highlights the stark, almost unbridgeable contrast to the later theological shifts that would come to equate abortion with murder from the moment of fertilization. These historical models, both Christian and Islamic, shared a common ground in their recognition of gradual fetal development and personhood. They often prioritized what we might call a more holistic view, incorporating the woman's lived experience, the medical judgment of practitioners, and the observable developmental stage of the fetus when considering the ethics of abortion. They offered what we can now clearly see as a historically pluralistic model of reproductive ethics. There wasn't a singular, universal, absolute condemnation from conception that spanned across these diverse traditions or even within them throughout history. It was a more complex, layered, and often practical understanding.
So recognizing this profound complexity really challenges the myth of an unbroken moral tradition that often underpins contemporary arguments, doesn't it? It means we can't just assume a straight, unwavering line of thought from antiquity to the present on this issue. And by challenging that myth, by bringing these forgotten nuances to light, it creates intellectual and ethical space to reconsider modern doctrines in light of their forgotten and often far more nuanced pasts. It forces us to ask, if it wasn't always this way, then what factors led to the change? 3. The rise of modern Catholic absolutism, a recent and radical redefinition.
Absolutely. The nuanced historical picture we've just painted provides a critical, illuminating backdrop against which to view the uncompromising moral absolutism of the modern Catholic position. This contemporary stance unequivocally declares that human life begins at conception, and therefore any attempt to terminate a pregnancy is equivalent to murder, a grave sin. This is a very clear, very strong theological statement that, as we discussed, many people mistakenly assume has always been the consistent position of the Church throughout its entire history.
But you're arguing that this isn't an ancient doctrine at all. You're
Yeah.
pointing out that this represents a truly radical redefinition of personhood, a seismic shift that didn't emerge from early Christian teachings, but rather through a gradual theological shift that really culminated only in the late 19th and most forcefully the 20th centuries. That's a monumental change in perception for many.
It is indeed a profound redefinition of a core theological concept. And nowhere is this monumental shift more visible and more forcefully articulated than in Evangelium Vitae, Pope John Paul II, 1995 encyclical. This document didn't just state the Church's position on abortion, it fundamentally repositioned abortion and other bioethical issues as part of a much broader, almost cosmic conspiracy against life. It effectively rebranded Catholic ethics around a stark, almost apocalyptic binary, a culture of life versus a culture of death. This wasn't merely a pastoral letter, it was a foundational document for the Church's engagement with modern society.
It's particularly interesting that it was published on March 25, 1995, the Feast of the Annunciation. That date must carry significant symbolic weight, given the encyclical central theme, and it speaks to the meticulous detail with which these pronouncements are made.
It's incredibly symbolic, and a testament to the Church's deep understanding of its own traditions. March 25th is the Feast of the Annunciation, a pivotal moment in Christian theology, commemorating the angel Gabriel's announcement to Mary that she would conceive Jesus. By choosing this specific date for the publication of Evangelium Vitae, the Church symbolically linked Mary's fiat, her willing and unconditional acceptance of God's will to become the Mother of God, to its own forceful endorsement of human life beginning unequivocally at conception. It was a powerful rhetorical and theological choice designed to imbue the doctrine with divine authority and underscore the sanctity of life from its earliest moments. As the historian of religion, Glona Rossa, meticulously explains in the source material, the document powerfully laments new and even more alarming threats to life, particularly those targeting the weak and defenseless in the womb, positioning abortion as a primary manifestation of these threats.
So it becomes clear that this encyclical is not just about abortion in isolation then. It's framed as part of something much, much bigger, a sweeping moral critique of modernity itself.
Exactly. The encyclical frames abortion and euthanasia not merely as isolated private medical or moral decisions, but as manifestations of a larger societal decline, a willful disintegration of moral order, a rejection of divine law, and a betrayal of humanity's true purpose. This sweeping diagnosis marks a significant and dramatic departure from the more gradualist, conditional moral frameworks we saw in earlier eras of church history. In John Paul II's powerful and often stark words, modernity itself suffers from a profound top-down anti-life conspiracy where, shockingly, certain crimes against life are treated as rights. This isn't just a critique of individual actions, it's a condemnation of an entire societal trajectory that the church views as deviating from God's plan for humanity.
And the consequence of that broad, overarching framing is pretty stark, isn't it?
Yeah.
It leaves very little room for discernment or varying circumstance.
The consequence is that the church, through Evangelium Vitae, collapses complex medical, social, and ethical distinctions into a singular, unwavering condemnation. It draws a rigid moral equivalence, equating abortion with horrific acts like infanticide and euthanasia. In doing so, it makes virtually no allowances for different stages of fetal development, for the traumatic circumstances surrounding a pregnancy, or for the profound complexities of individual conscience. It creates a rigid moral equivalence that the historical record, as we've discussed, simply doesn't support as an unbroken, continuous tradition within Christianity. It's an assertion of a singular truth that brooks no dissent or variation.
Here's where it gets really interesting and perhaps most challenging for popular understanding. How recent, historically speaking, is this absolutist framing? Because if it's truly a modern invention, that fundamentally changes how we understand the authority and historical continuity of this specific doctrine.
It is, in the grand sweep of church history, remarkably recent. As distinguished scholars like Sarah Butler and Monica Green, who have delved deeply into medieval and early modern church history, unequivocally confirm earlier church and legal authorities. And this includes figures as foundational to Christian thought as Augustine, the pivotal legal canonist Gratian, whose decretum shaped medieval canon law, and even the 13th century English legal scholars behind Bracton did not recognize life as definitively beginning at conception, nor did they universally condemn abortion as murder. Their views were, as we've already explored, far more nuanced, often tied to the observable milestones of quickening or ensoulment. The church itself had long distinguished between animation of the fetus, when it received a soul, and conception.
So when was the critical turning point then? When did this absolutist position actually become formal, codified doctrine within the Catholic Church? It feels like this is the linchpin of the entire historical argument.
The critical turning point was Pope Pius IX's declaration in 1869. This declaration, issued through the bull Apostolicae Sedis for the first time, formally stated that ensoulment occurred at conception. This marked the first formal doctrinal move toward the position that human life, imbued with a soul and therefore full moral status, begins at that very initial moment of fertilization. It's crucial for you, the listener, to grasp that this was a mere 150 years ago, not from the earliest days of Christianity. For nearly 18 centuries before this declaration, the Church operated with a more graduated understanding. It is only from this point forward, and especially solidified and expanded under Pope John Paul II's papacy in the late 20th century, that Catholic theology became fully aligned with the position that any abortion, regardless of its timing and gestation, is morally equivalent to killing a person and subject to immediate excommunication. This shift wasn't a clarification of an ancient truth, it was a novel theological assertion.
That's a profound implication. By projecting this relatively modern view backward in time, the Church is essentially implying a historical continuity that never existed. They're effectively reinterpreting centuries of their own history and legal tradition to support their present-day moral platform. It feels like a historical revisionism.
It is precisely that. This practice, by its very nature, erases centuries of theological debate and medical nuance, replacing a rich, complex historical understanding with a singular, unambiguous moral clarity. While this might feel righteous and unwavering to adherents and certainly offers a powerful rallying cry, it is ultimately ahistorical and exclusionary. What's more, by establishing this singular, newly defined understanding of life and morality as the only acceptable framework, it inherently delegitimizes any modern ethical system, whether it's feminist, medical, or secular, that doesn't conform. It presents itself as a universal and eternal truth when its historical foundations are, as we've seen, surprisingly shallow and recent. This is not simply a matter of doctrinal evolution, it's a strategic move to control narrative and moral authority. 4. Feminist resistance and reproductive agency. A powerful counter-narrative.
So while the modern Catholic Church was progressively articulating and promoting this universalizing culture of life, simultaneously across Europe and beyond, post-war feminist movements were emerging and offering a powerful, fundamentally different counter-narrative. How did their approach differ? And what was their core ethos in confronting these dominant religious and patriarchal systems?
Their approach was radically distinct from the theological one. It was rooted not in divine absolutes or pronouncements from ecclesiastical authority, but in the tangible realities of bodily autonomy, lived experience, and active medical agency. This movement gained particular significance in the geopolitical landscape of Cold War Europe, where women often found themselves caught between various powerful, often oppressive forces. Authoritarian regimes that dictated family size, deeply entrenched religious institutions that controlled moral norms, and patriarchal medical systems that often denied women control over their own bodies. In this complex and often hostile context, feminist activists actively and courageously reclaimed the discourse around abortion and contraception, reframing it not as a moral transgression or a societal ill, but as a fundamental matter of justice, health, and survival. For them, it was about a woman's right to determine her own future.
So, the fight wasn't just about accessing a medical procedure, it was about asserting basic human rights and dignity in the face of systemic control. What was the common ethos that united these diverse reproductive justice movements that sprang up from the 1960s to the 1980s?
Despite the myriad political and cultural contexts in which they operated, from the clandestine networks in Spain to the public protests in France, these movements shared a core, unifying ethos: the unwavering belief that women, quote, should not be reduced to vessels of reproduction controlled by church or state. This was a foundational principle, a direct challenge to centuries of patriarchal control and institutionalized subjugation that had, for too long, dictated women's reproductive lives. They argued that denying reproductive freedom was a denial of personhood itself, preventing women from participating fully and equally in society. This wasn't just about the absence of pregnancy, it was about the presence of choice and self-determination.
Can you give us a specific, compelling example of this activism in practice? Something that really brings this intense struggle and the ingenuity of these movements to life for our listeners.
A profoundly illustrative example comes from Spain during its post-Franco transition, a period still heavily influenced by Catholic dogma and conservative social norms. There, feminist activists resorted to producing and circulating samizdat literature, underground illicit publications, that openly denounced illegal abortion as inhumane torture and a barbaric operation. But the critical distinction here, and it's vital for our understanding, is why they use this intensely strong language. It wasn't primarily because the fetus suffered, as the Catholic narrative asserted. It was because women themselves were being subjected to pain, shame, and unsafe procedures in clandestine, often unsanitary conditions within a system that fundamentally refused to recognize their autonomy, their bodily rights, and their dignity. These underground publications weren't just protesting, they were practical empowering tools. They circulated vital, medically accurate knowledge on contraception, menstrual regulation, and even detailed instructions on safe abortion techniques. They were effectively reclaiming expertise from male-dominated institutions and medical authorities who had long monopolized this information, keeping women in the dark and at risk. It was an act of self-empowerment, a sharing of crucial knowledge that was deliberately withheld, enabling women to take control of their own health and futures.
That's a powerful reclamation of knowledge and agency. And it leads us to a specific tool that became truly transformative in this struggle, a method that symbolized liberation. The Carmen method. What was its significance, and how did it empower women and activists?
The Carmen method was a game changer. It was a remarkably simple, low-cost, and relatively non-invasive vacuum aspiration procedure for early-term abortion. While initially pioneered in the United States, its genius lay in its accessibility. It was rapidly adopted across Europe and became far more than just a medical procedure. It became a potent symbol of feminist innovation and collective self-help. As historians Bibia Pavard and Agata Ignatiuk meticulously highlight in their research, it was shared rapidly and transnationally through activist networks, often taught in women's health collectives, and fundamentally framed not merely as a clinical technique, but as a profound act of liberation.
So it wasn't just a medical breakthrough, but a political statement, a practical tool for systemic change.
Precisely. It represented autonomy in direct, tangible action. In countries like France, Poland, Italy, and Spain, where abortion was heavily restricted or outright illegal, women's groups didn't just advocate, they acted. They trained each other in Carmen procedures and actively organized underground abortion services, often in homes or makeshift clinics. This wasn't hidden in the shadows of shame. It was frequently undertaken in open defiance of religious and legal prohibitions, a direct, courageous challenge to the state and church systems that sought to control women's bodies and deny their rights. The act of sharing this knowledge and providing these services was a direct embodiment of their ethical framework, that women's lives and autonomy were paramount.
The modern Catholic position, as we've discussed, frequently frames such activism, especially efforts like the Carmen method or the spread of reproductive knowledge, as moral degradation. or even direct evidence of a culture of death. How do feminist scholars and activists respond directly to that powerful critique?
The critique, they argue, fundamentally fails to reckon with the conditions that necessitated these actions. It completely overlooks and dismisses the brutal systemic denial of reproductive autonomy, the widespread criminalization of contraception, and the profound societal refusal to treat women as full moral agents with inherent rights and rational decision-making capacities. What feminist movements powerfully demonstrated, both through their direct action and their sophisticated theoretical critiques, was that reproductive ethics could not be severed from the material realities of gender, poverty, and power. They weren't advocating for death, they were seeking to reclaim life on their own terms. They profoundly challenged the very idea that life begins and ends with a theological fiat, an abstract declaration disconnected from the lived realities of human suffering, dignity, and survival. Their fight was for a richer, more expansive definition of what it truly means to live a full life.
So what does this all mean for our broader understanding? It sounds like this feminist counter-narrative isn't just about defending abortion rights. It's a redefinition of what life itself means, encompassing not just biological existence, but a life lived with dignity, choice, and safety, free from coercion.
Exactly. For these movements, the feminist reclamation of reproductive knowledge, particularly during the politically charged Cold War era, stands not in opposition to life, but as a profound redefinition of what life truly entails. This redefinition actively encompasses the fundamental right to choose when and whether to give birth, the right to access safe and dignified health care, and the right to exist free from coercive religious and legal frameworks that deny bodily autonomy. It's about a holistic understanding of what it means to live a full, self-determined, and dignified life, a stark contrast to a framework that only values life as a biological state from conception, regardless of the person carrying it. It expands the ethical conversation beyond mere biological potential to encompass lived reality. The critique of universal moral language, the perils of absolutism. At the very heart of the modern Catholic position on abortion is a specific and incredibly powerful rhetorical move. It transforms what is, as we've meticulously detailed, a historically contingent and relatively recent theological stance into what it asserts is a universal, timeless moral absolute. This is not merely an opinion. It's a strategically crafted narrative designed to claim an immutable truth.
And the phrase culture of life functions is more than just a slogan here, doesn't it? It seems to claim a monopoly on moral truth, effectively shutting down any alternative perspectives or discussions.
It absolutely does. By collapsing diverse ethical perspectives, distinct historical legal traditions, and the complex scientific and medical realities into a singular, stark, and often emotionally charged binary, either you're for life or you're for death, it aims to control the entire narrative surrounding reproductive ethics. This rhetorical strategy is incredibly effective in galvanizing supporters and creating clear moral boundaries, but it comes at a significant cost, the cost of both historical accuracy and ethical pluralism. It creates a monolithic view where diversity once thrived, simplifying a profound human dilemma into an unyielding creed.
And what are the implications of this rhetorical strategy on how the Catholic Church views and actively engages with the modern world?
As the historian Glonna Rossa meticulously outlines, Evangelium Vitae and related teachings don't just state the Church's position on abortion, they portray the very permissibility of abortion in modern societies as a profound symptom of civilizational collapse. Pope John Paul II lamented a world where certain crimes against life are treated as rights, going so far as to present modern liberal democracies, with their emphasis on individual rights and secular governance, as complicit in a global anti-life conspiracy. This framing is designed to cast the Church as the sole bulwark against a rapidly decaying moral order, positioning secularism, individual autonomy, and even modern medicine as existential threats to the sanctity of life. It's a very dramatic and comprehensive indictment of contemporary society and its values.
This raises an important question. Does this framing account for earlier historical views? This framing, which describes modern developments as a collapse, actually account for or even acknowledge the earlier historical views and nuances that we've just spent so much time discussing. Because it sounds like it's creating a very specific, singular narrative that might not align with the past at all.
It most certainly does not, and that is the fundamental flaw in its historical claim. This framing completely ignores or actively dismisses the incontrovertible fact that earlier Christian legal traditions, such as those expressed in foundational medieval texts like Bracton and even the Mirror of Justices, explicitly rejected the classification of early abortion as murder. These texts, integral to the development of European law, operated with a nuanced developmental understanding of life, ascribing different moral and legal statuses based on the stage of gestation. What's even more critical for you, the listener, to truly grasp is this. The very notion of life beginning definitively at conception, with the full moral status of a human being, was not affirmed by the Catholic Church until Pope Pius IX's declaration in 1869, a staggering 18 centuries after Christ. This is not some ancient, unchanging dogma dating back to the apostles. It is a relatively recent, deliberately articulated doctrinal development. Prior to this, a nuanced, often graduated view prevailed for centuries, even within the Church's own intellectual traditions.
So this isn't just a minor doctrinal drift or slight reinterpretation. It's a profound shift, almost a strategic rewriting of history itself. What's fascinating here is how this framing ignores historical multiplicity, replacing it with a perceived universal eternal truth that was in fact only formally articulated in the last 150 years.
It is exactly that, a profound and strategic rewriting. It reveals how powerful religious institutions can, and indeed sometimes do, retroactively rewrite moral history to suit contemporary ideological needs. By consciously ignoring the rich multiplicity of medieval Christian views, the pragmatism of Islamic legal and medical traditions, and even early modern Christian views on fetal development, pregnancy, and agency, the Catholic Church presents its current teaching as if it were self-evident, eternal, and universally binding, a truth that has always been the case. In doing so, it accomplishes a significant erasure. It erases not only competing traditions, but also the human experiences that shaped them, from the medieval midwife who provided practical care and guidance, to the sophisticated jurist who carefully weighed moral distinctions, to the modern-day reproductive health worker providing essential care. It creates a vacuum of historical context, substituting it with an idealized yet ultimately fabricated continuity.
And this kind of moral absolutism, this claim to universal truth that overrides historical nuance and lived experience, has faced significant critiques from feminist perspectives for decades, hasn't it?
Absolutely. Feminist critiques have long sounded the alarm against precisely this kind of moral absolutism. As scholars and activists profoundly emphasize, particularly during the Cold War era when state and religious control over women's bodies was often overtly oppressive, universalizing moral claims often serve to suppress dissent and obscure underlying power dynamics. The Church's invocation of life becomes problematic here, not because life itself is unworthy of protection, a point feminists would largely agree with, but precisely because the term is often used as a powerful ideological weapon. It is deployed to discipline women's bodies, constrain scientific inquiry, and delegitimize alternative ethical frameworks that are instead grounded in fundamental principles like autonomy, consent, and the lived experience of human beings. The language of life, in this context, becomes less about compassion and more about control.
So bringing all these threads together, what picture emerges? So what does this all mean? It sounds like the culture of life framework, while powerful, effectively collapses the inherent tension between belief and justice, replacing a necessary pluralism of moral thought with a singular, unyielding authority.
That's precisely it. The language of moral universality, when it becomes untethered from historical nuance, detached from social context, and divorced from the lived realities of human experience, risks becoming a powerful tool of ideological imposition. By claiming to speak for all life and for all time, without acknowledging its own historical evolution or the legitimate diversity of human experience, Catholic doctrine inadvertently silences the very rich diversity of moral reasoning that has historically defined human attempts to navigate the profound complexities of reproduction, suffering, and responsibility. It seeks a single definitive answer where history overwhelmingly shows that humanity has always grappled with a multitude of perspectives and difficult choices. It risks becoming an instrument of power rather than an invitation to compassion and understanding.
Outro. So, to succinctly recap our deep dive today, the history of abortion is far from one of unbroken, monolithic condemnation. Instead, it's a rich, complex tapestry woven from diverse, context-dependent moral reasoning. This includes the subtle medieval distinctions around quickening and ensoulment that shaped early Christian legal thought, the remarkable medical pragmatism found in Islamic traditions, and even the powerful necessary resistance of modern feminist movements that fought for bodily autonomy and dignity. The current culture of life stance, so powerfully promoted by the Catholic Church today, while rhetorically potent and deeply felt by its adherents, reflects neither historical consensus nor theological continuity. Rather, it emerges from a remarkably recent doctrinal shift, formalized in the late 19th century and solidified in the late 20th century, that absolutizes the moment of conception, and in doing so casts all reproductive autonomy as part of a profound moral crisis.
And the implications of this historical insight are truly profound, inviting us to a deeper, more informed level of understanding. To build an ethical discourse on abortion that is both truly just and historically informed, we must challenge the illusion of moral universality that is often imposed by powerful institutions like the Church. Instead, we need to courageously embrace a framework that acknowledges complexity, that understands the developmental nature of life as it has been understood for centuries, and that robustly centers individual agency and the lived experience of women. This means grappling with the messiness and richness of history, rather than allowing it to be smoothed over by a singular, convenient narrative.
And so, for you, our listener, here's a final thought to mull over as you go about your day, building on all we've discussed. What does it truly mean to have true reverence for life? Does it necessarily require theological rigidity, an unbending doctrine imposed from above, disconnected from historical context and individual reality? Or does it demand a profound moral honesty, an honesty that fully recognizes the lived realities of women throughout history and today, an honesty that acknowledges the complex evolution of ethical thought across centuries, and the very real possibility of life-affirming choice, not as a threat, but as an essential element of any compassionate, truly just society? It's a question that challenges us to look beyond simplistic binaries and engage with the full, often uncomfortable spectrum of human experience and wisdom. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you feel a little more well-informed and perhaps a lot more curious. We'll see you next time.